Thanks everyone for joining. This is our last episode of the season, or somewhat called season. And we got Matt Hauck going over applied sports science. He's a sports scientist for Providence, and he's going to give more of a bio. But I kind of met him through Twitter, and then he reached out once he found out I was going to Oregon State because he doesn't talk to anyone else if they don't go to Oregon State. So we built our connection there and kept in the loop for other topics. And I said, hey, you know what? I don't think well, I'll speak for myself. I didn't know a lot about sports science and how it related to PT. And honestly, I still don't understand what sports science truly is and how it can be used because right now it's just a lot of data. But I'm hoping Matt can clear that up for all of us and how we can use it in the rehab or performance setting. So go ahead and introduce yourself, Matt. Thanks for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you, Vian. Really happy to be here. As Vian mentioned, I am currently with Providence, and I'm the program manager of sports performance, which is kind of a new area for Providence within the sports medicine department. We serve 7,000 student athletes across the Oregon region with athletic trainers at over 20 high schools, obviously supporting the healthcare need from the athletic training standpoint. But as we are growing and expanding, we are diving into some performance initiatives. And I've been with Providence part-time since about the end of 2017, early 2018. There were a few years where I was dual between full-time with the Portland Timbers and then as a secondary role, kind of a symbolic partnership role, I was part-time at Providence. Right before the pandemic hit, I went full-time on with Providence Sports Medicine, which, in hindsight, knowing that everything that all those pro teams went through, especially the Timbers, kind of feel like I dodged a bit of extra craziness diving in when I did, but at the same time, let it be known for the record that once I left, they went on and won the MLS's Bat Cup, so maybe it was good for them. But not only was I with the Portland Timbers, as Ben mentioned, we got some Oregon State connections. I was at Oregon State. I finished grad school at Oregon State, and I was simultaneously working for Brian Miller at the time, director of performance with the football team, starting up some sports science initiatives then. I worked in the private sector. And just for full disclosure to everybody, I do work with a couple of sports technology and sports software companies. So I want full disclosure there. Power AMS, you're going to see it a little bit here because it's going to help me visualize some of the information we're talking about. So full disclosure there that I do work with them. Secondary, we're not going to talk about it as much today, but I work for Intake Health. So I want that known to everybody here. In addition, as I was addressing the prior staffs I work with the Timbers, the prior staffs I work with Oregon State, the things that I speak about here, there's some concepts that we use in the past with them. It's not necessarily reflective of exactly what they are both doing now. So I don't want anyone to think that I'm giving away all their trade secrets. But the staffs there, I'm in touch with the current staffs at Oregon State University as well as keeping close with the Timber staff. So I know that they're continuing to do a fantastic job. My basis and background actually started in strength and conditioning. Once upon a time back in 2004, I was a collegiate athlete. I played college football. But even in my early days of strength and conditioning, I had interest in athlete monitoring and assessment. Are the training programs we're doing actually working and doing what they say they're doing? Are athletes actually getting better? Having the audacity to dive into the programs and assess athlete performance and say, well, they're actually getting stronger. They're actually getting faster. How are they responding to the program? So the transition more into a sports science-centered role was really natural to me because I was asking the same questions. And as a sports scientist, I consider myself more of a generalist because from a data side, they're way better data scientists than me for sure. From more of an applied practitioner side, there are better biomechanists than myself. There are better applied researchers than myself. There are better physiologists than myself. I do consider myself a generalist of knowing the limitations of where my skills end and where the experts that I need to go and seek out are. But as I mentioned, I was a collegiate athlete. I got into sports the same reason as many of you get into sports, because we had some really great positive impacts from coaches that helped excel our career. But then, like many of you, I had a couple of coaches or a couple of positions that really challenged me. I said, I want to dig deeper and find out, like, how do you perform better? How do you stay injury resilient? Those types of things. And I've been super fortunate to work at the collegiate level, as I mentioned, at Oregon State, professional sport, and within Olympics, within Olympic setting athlete as well. What is the purpose of today? Why? What are we hoping to accomplish here? I'd love to outline some practical concepts to assist staff and coordinate athlete monitoring practices aimed at optimizing both individual and team performance, which is a really fancy way of saying what I really want to get out of today. I want to arm you all as the practitioners with a practical framework of sports science methodology that can be used where the boots are on the ground in the real world setting, and not just on the convenient, 220 character Twitter splash or Instagram post about show and tell. These are lessons learned from the front line about how to deal with real common problems to help you as practitioners use a framework of answering specific questions, particularly from sports coaches and athletes themselves, but predominantly sports coaches, because at the end of the day, that's the population that we, in addition to the athletes, have to interact with are the coaches themselves. All of the presentations that we have been able to learn from these past weeks and months give us and galvanize our tools to address really specific things, specific injuries, specific rehab intervention tools and techniques. We've got to listen to literally the experts in the field. And what today's about is a big picture view of, okay, you have incredible sharpened tools now. Is there a way of sequencing some of those tools and methodology to problem solve some specific but prevalent problems from a broader scope? So the systematic approach I want to outline for you all is kind of what I coined years ago, analysis progression. And it's kind of a word fancy jargon way of saying the way that you ask questions about performance and an athlete's response to performance. And I want to talk about defining outcomes in the period of performance analysis and how that performance analysis progression fits within that pyramid. What's on our end of the pyramid in the realm of sports medicine, physical therapy, sports performance, and what's on the top of that pyramid in regards to team sport, to winning games, to titles, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll want to talk about those tiers. Think about the ecosystem of high performance. We've heard the term silos. Everyone talks about silos, and you know what? They still kind of exist. But in a high performance setting, the medical team, where the athletic trainers and physical therapists and team doctors and maybe nutritionists reside, or maybe nutrition's its own department overall. We work alongside the performance department where there are strength coaches. Depending on the pro or collegiate setting, you have general managers, technical directors, owners, etc. Maybe in the collegiate setting, maybe it's senior administration is maybe in that box as well. Sports science kind of fits in and amongst that. I want to demonstrate how sports science fits in and amongst these kind of quote unquote silos, but I also maybe want to help clarify or shed light on the role that sports science can play in this environment. Because today I want to talk about a really specific problem faced by all of us at one time. And I will almost guarantee, I'll stop shy of guaranteeing, but I will almost guarantee that either someone watching today has experienced this himself or has worked alongside of, say, a strength and conditioning coach who has been pressed with this problem from a sports coach particularly. This is a common problem, and I'm going to outline how common the problem is. Not problem, but issue, occurrence. Think of it, let's do some applied problem solving. And I know that some of us here have heard this ourselves. When we hear from a sports coach specifically, the statement, we're not in shape. We're not in shape enough to play. I've heard that from coaches that I played for. I've heard that from coaches I've worked with as a sports coach or as a sports scientist or performance coach. And it's a hard question to grapple with because this occurs often. It occurs in multiple sports and embodies itself in different ways. I'm going to just outline some examples that are very present and prevalent. Spring football right now down at UCF, brand new coach comes in. I've experienced this in my time at the collegiate level at various settings. A new coach comes in and says, you know what? I'll let you read the fine print. I'll push pause on the recording, whatever. But the general gist of this is we're in spring ball. We're in the off season. We're doing things new in my way. Of course, we're out of shape, but we're going to really run them hard on the field and off so they get in shape the way that we want them. It's actually really common in college football. I don't know if it's meant to be a subtle dig from the new coach back to the old coach to say, well, you just got to get in better shape to play for us. That's not a dig at any of these coaches, but if you look at it and you pay attention, you've been in the room, it happens often. We're not in shape enough to play. we're the new kids on the block, we're the new sheriff in town, we have to go up to play. Great. It's not unique to college football. The NBA a couple years ago when Coach Lou was with the Cavs, he said, I want to change our style of play. And we're not in shape enough to play that up-tempo. We got to run. We got to get in better shape. We need to up the ante to play the way that I want to play. So it's not unique to football. We're seeing it in professional basketball as well. And guess what? The world that I came from in soccer, in professional soccer here in North America, new coach comes in, new tactics come into play. And this is a really specific example from actually just recently, where a club, Toronto FC, has a new coach. They want to adapt a new style of play. Their new manager thinks in terms of, well, I want to pay attention to what happens on the field. The type of system that I want to deploy requires a lot of specific workload, requires a lot of accelerating and sprinting. And what was interesting is the context that the Toronto coach knew we covered almost the most distance per game in the league last year. Of all the teams, we covered the most average distance or near the most average distance, but we actually sprinted very little from all that. And what they are looking to change this year, well, we're already doing a lot more sprinting. We've already ramped that up. They had a really specific preseason where they had to play Champions League, which means you're playing games a lot earlier than you normally would in a normal MLS league, where they've already had a couple of games under their belt, as have the Portland Timbers, for example. But in that quick change and that quick ramp up and turnaround, the coach is saying, yes, we're seeing it. We're still moving along to it. And by the way, we kind of paid a price for it because, with racking up that type of workload so early, there have been more injuries. Now, I want to be explicitly clear. This is not a dig at any of those teams, not a dig at any of those staffs. There's no blaming of, shame on you, this or that. They can definitely just be unlucky. I'm not making any comment about that particular staff. The only point I wanted to make is I just showed you 3 different sports from just the last few years where every coach has said basically the same thing. We're not in shape enough to play the way that I want to play. Let's think about that problem that we're faced with, or the circumstance that we were faced with when the coach says, I don't think we're in shape enough to play. From our standpoint in the performance realm, whether it's sports med, strength and conditioning, sports science, whatever it might be, we're kind of all allied health and performance staff right now. Think about the really popular concept of the 4 pillars of performance. There have been several people who, years ago, popularized this notion of the 4 different pillars that go into like team sport or individual performance in a team sport. Your technical, your tactical, your physical, your mental, social, where on the technical side, those are like your individual skills, like your ball handling, your dribbling, your passing, all the technical skills that help you operate within your team to then execute your tactical skills, which are basically just X's and O's. Your plays, your style of play, your attack, your formation, whatever it might be. That's kind of the general gist and difference between those two. From the mental, social aspect, this could also be siphoned further into cultural, cognitive. Think of mental skills, motivation, communication, interaction with your environment or between people. That definitely impacts the way you play. And then probably from our standpoint, the one that we deal with the most is the physical aspect, the type of work you do, how often you do it, how hard, et cetera, et cetera. For coaches telling us, like, what is specifically occurring, coach, that makes you say we're not in shape enough to play, or you come to the conclusion like we have some sort of lack of being in shape or lack of fitness? And maybe us right now, we talk about a checklist that we work through to determine, okay, what exactly did you mean? Because if I'm to address this problem, I need to know exactly what you're talking about. So if we want to rule out all other possibilities before we get to the point of, okay, we're in shape or we're not in shape, we need to train more, we need to change our training. Let's first start with just a quick checklist of, can we rule out all the other possibilities before we start addressing our physical performance? So from the technical side, the way that we execute our skills, coach, are you saying that we're slow or unable to execute technical skills? Like, think in soccer, did you have a poor first touch, or was it repeated poor first touches, passes? In basketball, were you losing dribbles? Were you turning the ball over with sloppy passes? Football, did you have sloppy hand technique? Were you standing up too quickly? If that's what you're using, ask the basic question of, all right, did the athlete ever have that technical skill to begin with? That were they ever able to do that fresh in the first place? Was there any point where they displayed good technical skill, or the decision to execute the right technical skill? So rule out the technical form of coach. If you're unhappy with their technical skills, just simple question: were they ever able to do it well in the first place when they were fresh and we knew that they were fresh? Or is the slowness that you're talking about not them being out of shape, but is it just lack of competency about how to execute that skill? And then likewise, you ask the same, if you've ruled that out, okay, let's talk X's and O's. If we're not executing play, are you saying that we look slow and you're determining we're slow or out of shape because we're not able to execute passages of play, certain parts of our technique, certain parts of our X's and O's about running plays or being in transition or running the right defensive schemes, whatever it might be? Were they ever fast to do those things in the first place? Ask yourself as a coach, do they actually know how to be in the right position to make the play in the first place? Because if you're talking about consistently being half a step slow and you're saying, oh, we must be out of shape. Well, no, maybe they're just out of position. They're in fine physical shape. They have the skills to do it, but tactically they don't know where to line up correctly, or they don't know how to read the opponent correctly and then understand what they need to do after they've made the correct read, or decide to execute in a timely fashion. These are all the tactical elements that might say, you know what? Just because they're breathing hard and made a mistake doesn't mean they're out of shape. Because what happens to the athlete who's breathing hard and made the play? Two athletes, they're both breathing hard. One outcome was they made the play. The other athlete, also breathing hard, was a half step slower. Are we treating one athlete as quote unquote out of shape because they didn't make the play? But yet the same other athlete's breathing hard and made the play. Is he or she just a hard worker? But in both instances, the athlete's breathing hard, but the impression from the coach is much different. So rule out the tactical and technical aspects first of, do they even know what to do in the first place, and do they ever have the ability to demonstrate that skill? What's fascinating to me is the mental or social aspect of it. And going back to this could be several other different pillars. I think this whole understanding of our pillars are going to totally expand. But for our purposes, do they have the mental or social skills to be able to communicate or listen to direction in order to execute a certain skill? Do they have the desire to take that action necessary to execute those skills in the first place? Think about personality traits. Think about motivational orientation. Think about somebody who doesn't necessarily want to be the superstar that's thrust into like a starting role. Maybe that's changed their performance outcomes. Or vice versa, someone who's asked to change position to something that's a less glamorous role. That can change their motivation, their desire to execute quickly, and maybe that makes it appear that, oh, all of a sudden they're out of shape. But if we have ruled all those others out, we can get to the nitty-gritty of what we do in the sports science realm of, well, let's ask some questions of their physical performance. We've gone through the checklist. We're ending the checklist on the physical side of, if you're saying that they look slow and out of shape because they were unable to perform the task at hand, just being blunt, were they ever fast enough to execute the task at hand one time? And to what intensity were they ever able to do it? Because if they have the skills, they know the X's and O's, and their mindset or cognitive space is right, if they're just physically not up to the task, then yeah, we can address that through our training and through our understanding of fitness assessment. But how was the fitness determined in the first place? Were you doing any fitness testing, or did you just kind of go out and play? I can tell you in American football, fitness testing is either totally non-specific to football, usually, or they just don't do fitness testing at all. We've been training hard all summer. Our guys are rip-roaring ready to go. Soccer is a bit different because there's some more standardized ways than in soccer is just much more fluent in the athlete monitoring and assessment realm to begin with. There's a bunch of different tests that can be administered to give us a quantified level of fitness that we can then do something about and progress over the course of a 4 to 6 week preseason. But ask yourself, if you're doing that test, how is the test determined in the first place? Because if the coach says, gosh, they're out of shape, and 2, we've determined it's a physical issue, then go back to your fitness testing. If you did fitness testing, how is that test? What was the criteria for selecting that test? Maybe you need to revisit the selection of the test to begin with. From the physical aspect, if you were determining an athlete is out of shape and you've made the determinant that it's a physical problem and not a technical, tactical, or cognitive issue, you have to start with understanding what are the demands of the game to begin with. I don't care about practice. Practice, in some cases, rarely matches up with the physical demands of the game simply because of the fact that we fail to quantify objectively what the actual physical demands of the games are. I'm not pressing anyone to use a specific tool or specific type of technology to assess that, but quite simply, if you don't know basic physical outputs of what the athletes have to go through in a match, how can you even determine what the proper physical performance properties are to prepare them for that? So this is an example of match statistics of some really basic rudimentary physical workloads. And what I want to draw your attention to is the performance analysis progression. This is part of the performance analysis progression that helps us answer those questions of what are the actual demands? So start off summarizing what is the total amount of work performed over a certain time. I don't care what the metric is, what's the total amount? But we need a little bit more granularity than just knowing that a soccer player covers 11 kilometers a game. Great, I can go walk 11 kilometers. I've covered 11 kilometers distance. Am I ready to play soccer? No. So getting some subtotals of some discrete ranges below that of understanding maybe there's this amount of walking, maybe there's this amount of jogging, striding, sprinting, etc. Okay, now we have some relative understanding of the different discrete zones of the type of work that's occurring, but it's still not enough. We need more granularity. Get the total amount of efforts it took to achieve those zones. So for example, if you determine I covered 200 meters of distance while I was sprinting at a certain velocity, well, how many times did I actually sprint in the game? Did I just, random example, just do one crazy down and back and I covered 200 meters one time? Or were there 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 different sprinting efforts that went into achieving that 200 meters? And even from there, we need more granularity, because I don't want to just learn to do 10 reps of 20 meters with full recovery in between. I need to know the density of when that work occurs to give us context about the level of overall intensity from that passage of play. So for example, if I just did 20 repetitions of 10 meters, did I wait 2 minutes in between each portion of the game? Or was there a scurry of back and forth of 20 meters, 20 meters, 20 meters with little to no rest? And then was there a long gap of 15 or 20 minutes before I did it again? What's the density like? The frequency is the final part of that density component, because it just simply tells us, as I just highlighted, when does the density occur? How do I train for those? Because what we want to understand is what's the most intense type of work you need to do? How often and how dense does it occur? That is our job then as the practitioner, to use those tools to answer those questions, to say, aha, now we know what the test bar is. Now we know where the bar is set. They have to be able to not just do this, but thrive as they do this, and probably be able to be comfortable doing a bit more. This is based on our specific style of play. It is individualized to not just groups and positions, but to the individual athlete itself. Because even individual athletes in the same style of play, whether it's soccer or basketball or football, even if they're playing the same position, they may have their own unique style of going about these things. So then as you go back to the objective data from the match itself, which you see in the lower right-hand corner are some of those descriptors and some of the granularity of those descriptors of not just understanding the totals, but understanding the subtotals, understanding the density, understanding the most difficult passages of play based on our style and our system, excuse me. Us as the practitioner, whether you're a strength and conditioning coach or particularly a physical therapist or athletic trainer, once we know what's required of the athlete, we all have the domain expertise of understanding, all right, I know some of the mechanical components that go into sprinting, maximal acceleration, deceleration, change of direction. I know the tissues involved and the issues with some of those tissues, if you will. I know that some of the motor learning and technique issues that may exacerbate or place excessive stress on those tissues during that kind of mechanical work. I know the physiological underpinning. I know the bioenergetics that we need to support that specific type of fitness for not just doing the bout, but doing it often, recovering between, and then, by the way, performing well in between those bouts of density. And even some of the psychological traits of, okay, I know some of the psychological traits or motivational adherence that I might need to coach or train towards to help build those maybe context-specific moments of resiliency when those tough times arise in the game. That's where we, as the practitioners, go. We know the specific demands, and we know all the domain-specific physiological components about how to train and support those. Where does it fit into the big picture? Because great, we know the demands, but in the period of performance analysis, what I want to draw out from this is at the bottom levels of the pyramid are the physical domain that we're talking about right now. We're trying to address the problem of, are the athletes in shape to begin with? Or why are they not in shape if it's a physical aspect? Level 1 and level 2 of the pyramid of performance analysis. First of all, the entire pyramid is supposed to be comprehensive of understanding what goes into an athlete performing on one side. And at the very top of the pyramid, what are the performance outcomes of the team? Winning championships, national titles, league cups, etc. So you see there's all these steps in between, from health and wellness, being able to play in the first place, how they actually physically perform, and then how their technical skills and their tactical objectives create chances for success on the field. How do we capitalize on success for us and minimize success for the team? Because if we do that, we're going to get to the point of winning more games and losing fewer games, which means finally at the very top, we're achieving our goals of conference championships, league titles, etc. So in terms of the problem that we're trying to answer, the coach says we are not in shape enough to play. Well, we've just defined the physical parameters of what it takes to play whatever position in whatever sport. But from a foundational level, we have to ask, if you're saying the athletes look out of shape or appear out of shape, from a foundational aspect, were they ready to perform that day in the first place? What was their recovery status? I call it performance inputs. What did they show up? What were they able to do that day? Now, just because someone is not recovering well doesn't mean they can't go out and play the game of their life. I've had plenty of circumstances where I can think of athletes who showed up. They didn't sleep very well. They didn't feel super hydrated. They were a little bit sore, and they went out as a pro or as a college, whatever it was, and played extraordinarily well. So just because their wellness isn't optimal doesn't mean they can't play well. But what it does mean is that they'll probably play for it the day after or the day after that. They're digging themselves in a little bit deeper hole to fully recover from. So if we have an issue with the way an athlete played and we say, we know it's a physical issue, ask yourself the first question from the basic level. What was the input to performance? Were they ready to perform in the first place? What were their recovery levels? However you were choosing to track that, this is just a few options to it, but whether you're doing wellness questionnaires, sleep, different types of HRV, other types of readiness assessments, whether it's, maybe it's through force plates, maybe it's through CNS assessments, whatever it might be. If you are going to answer this question, have that context. Because if the performance inputs were not very good, if the recovery was low, and then we subsequently saw poor physical performance, maybe we need to address the readiness and recovery before we start going and doing more training. It's kind of the Captain Obvious statement of the slide, but we have to eliminate all other possibilities first. So as we've moved forward from performance inputs at level 1, what actually occurred? What actually is occurring at level 2 when we're assessing performance, whether it's training, practices, or games, competition itself, what's actually occurring there? So whatever metric you're keeping track of, what is a typical output for the game for that specific individual and how they play in your system? And if they're residing below, at, or above a quote unquote normal, and we're still answering, we have the context of their readiness to perform. If they are ready to perform and they still underperform, then is it still a physical fitness issue? Or if they were ready to perform and they did not hit that, is it still a physical performance issue? But most importantly, we need to think about event and response. So great, we saw in the event, they look slow, they look out of shape. Okay. the next day, how are they responding? Because if they were well rested and recovered, went out and played what you considered to be suboptimally, they didn't hit their normal zones. But then the next day or the day after, whatever it is, they're showing up and their recovery and muscle soreness is not off the chart. What it's telling us is that, okay, maybe it is a physical conditioning and maybe we do need to ramp things up, because clearly if they underperformed physically but responded well the day after, then it shows that they can probably handle a little bit more that's really context specific. But on the flip side, if they had good recovery and readiness to perform, then they subsequently went out and underperformed and made us think, gosh, they're not in shape. And then the next day or day after they show up and their wellness and recovery is very poor, it's probably not a time to ramp up, but it's time to slowly and methodically increase workload over time. That context of event and response to the event is critical for planning going forward and making these decisions. So as we move forward, we've already gone through the performance analysis progression. Great. We've asked the question. Now we know the granularity of, let's ask the specific questions about how much work did they do, what type of subcomponents did they do, the counts, the density, the frequency of those events, and then how do they respond to that specific workload task over time. Soccer, football, basketball, all of them have unique schedules in terms of how many games a week do you typically play, how many games over a season, all the different loading parameters and weekly match day events, etc. They are all different, but from a practitioner standpoint, we each know the demands of what they would be out to, of this is what practice typically looks like 2 days after or 3 days after or 2 or 3 days before a game. We then can work backwards and know it's appropriate now to put the pedal to the metal to raise that bar within these specific contexts. And then from the physical therapy side or from the athletic training side or the health and wellness side, maybe you are gearing treatments or preventative treatments on certain days knowing, hey, we're going to do a lot of small-sided games today. Maybe this particular player needs a little bit more work on whatever tissues or treatments you're doing on the anterior chain versus posterior chain, whatever it is. You all are the domain experts in that area. But knowing what they're up against and knowing we need to push them in certain areas and knowing those areas need certain stressors, that certainly helps make it a little bit more clear for the path forward. So with these pillars of performance, making sure we've eliminated all the other possibilities by going down the quick checklist. Once we get to the physical domain, diving in and best understanding the specific demands and knowing how the athletes respond to the specific demands and knowing if we need to overload in certain areas. What we've really actually done is taken these like quadrants or pillars, and from our standpoint in health and performance, we've kind of restructured it to where the foundation of what we want to do to help athletes better display their technical skills in order to better execute their tactical objectives. Well, we are going to arm them with better physical tools if we've determined that the physical fitness was the issue. So by the system of approaching and asking these questions, we've taken the quadrant and prioritized it into a foundational triangle where we can move up to stratify. This perfectly relates, I think, to another common problem, which has already been addressed in the past weeks on the presentations. And the common question that you might get from coaches or general managers or agents or sometimes parents, administrators, all right, the athlete's injured. They've been in your care. Well, when are they going to be ready again? This framework between the performance analysis progression and the period of performance analysis itself allows you to very neatly, in a very tidy way, focus and hone in on the foundational levels of understanding the athlete's current state, understanding their performance, and understanding what's required in competition to then go, all right, you as the practitioner, you're in charge of the treatment plan now. I'm going to make up a scenario where it's a grade 2 left hamstring strain. You know what the timeline would be in your head. You've seen, maybe it's imaging you saw, maybe you were doing the muscle testing yourself. You know where this athlete's starting at. You are planning out the next several weeks to get them to the point where, all right, we've cleared this, this, and this. Now we can start doing these things. you have all the expertise on what the tissues and the tissue resiliency needs to be, the tissue healing needs to go, whatever path it is. You know the bioenergetics and maybe morphological aspects of the remodeling and how long that's going to take so that you can clear them to getting to a higher level of training on that injured limb, where then you can go and take the performance analysis progression with all the tools and approaches that you have as practitioners and use a practitioner-driven model of, okay, I know how I'm going to treat. I know what the prognosis is. I know which phase of therapy we are. And now you have objective information to refer back to in saying, athlete A is not yet cleared for task X, Y, and Z because we're in week 3 and we're only doing, we've just cleared body weight. We haven't got into ballistic stuff yet, whatever it might be. But then you can turn around to the coach, the agent, the GM, the administrator and say, we can't do activity Y until we've achieved X. But once we achieve X and get into Y, this is the path that we need to go. And this is about how long it typically takes. And these are the markers that I'm looking for. Because at the very end chain, once they get to, let's say, Z, we can start playing again. You know exactly what those markers are. You know exactly what those metrics are in terms of the reason that we're still at point Y and point Z and when I'm not fully handing him or her over to you is because I know exactly what's required in their position, the intensity and the amplitude of what's required in normal play. I have their baseline information. More importantly, I know where they stack up to now. So whatever tools you're using, whatever approaches you're using, this construct fits neatly around that and can adapt to many different approaches and models. But the big hammer is that it's totally driven by yourself and that you're dealing with objective information that everyone can see and agree on, because it's not you just saying, I think or I feel this way. It's like, no, I'm doing these specific treatments because of this specific information. This is the reason that they are at stage 5 instead of stage 6 or whatever it might be in your own return to play philosophy. This approach tucks very neatly within the period of performance analysis because that whole pyramid is designed to objectively quantify the demands placed on the athlete and the system of asking questions of what that looks like. So early on in the presentation, we saw this kind of siloed approach of, all right, we kind of all work together, sports science fits in, but what's the real goal of maintaining a high performance ecosystem? Or how do you achieve a high performance ecosystem? Because that's like a sexy term that people sometimes just throw around. And I agree with that. I think it's the term that's thrown around. But what I really wanted to communicate through this approach and presentation is that sports science, when done well in a high performance ecosystem, should be the conduit or common language between everybody. What I love about physical therapists in a lot of ways, you all are the original sports scientists, because athlete monitoring and assessment is central and critical to everything you do, with assessments that you perform with a patient, reassessments, checkoffs, planning, prescribing. In many ways, sports scientists need to turn back to the sports medicine community and go, you guys have been doing this all along. And while we have a lot of new theories and a lot of other things, where the rubber meets the road, you all have been doing this for decades longer than the people like me. Not to dog on our field at all, but physical therapists have been going through this process for years and decades longer than a sports scientist has. Yes, we're taking new things or adding new things in a different approach, but sports science, when done well, should align very well with the concept that any physical therapist practitioner comes to the table with of, oh yeah, I have baselines, I reassess, I monitor these things. These are how I plan things out. These are the measuring sticks, if you will, that I hold to different types of patients for different types of issues. Conceptually, you all have been doing this the whole time. From the sports science standpoint, in a optimally performing high performance ecosystem, staff particularly, it's just simply the conduit and the language that people would have between each other, such that our PTs or our athletic trainers, they know and understand the things that the strength coaches are looking for. maybe they're not full on strength coaches, but they at least know what they're looking at to have an understanding of, that's kind of the handoff between us, and vice versa. No strength and conditioning coach should, be putting hands on and treating athletes the same way that yourself or athletic trainer should, but they should have an understanding of, okay, this is where an athlete's at. These are the types of things that need to be going on. I have to follow the script based on the assessments that they're doing. And likewise, between the nutritionist or maybe the sports scientist himself, to understand those things and where all the overlap is, because at the end of the day, we need to care for athletes and keep them available on the field. But it also helps us unite our front on the health and performance side to be able to turn to a sports coach and say, I know what you're up against when you're trying to play these types of X's and O's. I'm not the sports coach, but I do know a lot about what is required of the player to do that, and I can do a much better job keeping your athletes on the field when I can support them in this way. So real quick, finishing off, big thanks to Bien. We've got to connect over the last year in the pandemic, and I really enjoy getting able to talk shop, and I'm looking forward to, hopefully not too much longer, who knows, being able to get back down to good old Corvallis and seeing the new stomping grounds. That would be fantastic. Definitely a big thank you to the prior staffs that I've worked with for all the learning and opportunities. Brian Miller at Oregon State, Jamie Rodriguez, Jeff Macy, Eric Turnstrom, Nate Berry, Mike Johnson, Izzy, everybody down there. They do a fantastic job. The new football staff, Brian, Mike, and those guys as well. They're awesome. So big thank you to being able to work with and learn them. My old Portland Timbers and Thorns staff as well. For all the fun we had, all the learning I got to do, and for all the great work that they've continued to do and will continue to do. Dean Riddle and Sean McLaurin, I get to learn from those practitioners day in and day out with some of the projects that we're in from the Power AMS team. Sean McLaurin is one of the co-authors of the book that Vien mentioned, the email. I did have a study or a research document connected to this, but the new NSCA textbook on applied sports science, or Essentials of Sports Science. Sean McLaurin is one of the authors there for the RPE chapter. Super brilliant guy. I'm super lucky to learn from him and Dean every day. And for all the people here and all the people who are recording, I love talking shop and learning from you all. Just because we're maybe not in the exact same position, we do work in the same high performance ecosystems, and I am always eager to connect and learn. LinkedIn, I'm not super active on Twitter and Instagram. I'm there, but LinkedIn, I like to connect and converse and share some ideas, and really appreciate the opportunity to connect and talk shop. So with that, would you like me to stop sharing, Vin, or how would you like to next step?
No, we could leave that on. Thanks for your talk. I actually feel like it cleared things up for me. I think the number one thing I got from this is that, if we have a problem, it's like you guys are essentially the research department. If we have a problem, then you guys are helping us determine the question we need to answer. You guys aren't maybe giving us the answer right away, but you're kind of figuring out, well, before we answer that, we need to figure this out, which is the downside of research. It takes forever because you have to kind of backpedal a bit. But that was helpful. I thought it was really helpful that you mentioned the tactical side, like, why is this person slow? Sometimes we work with underclassmen in college, and we'll rehab them, they're ready to go, and then they don't feel like they're getting where they should be, or they're not, like we thought, oh man, like this guy's gonna be a beast, he's gonna start, and all of a sudden they're not starting anything. And we keep looking at the physical side, but we don't pay attention. They don't know the playbook or anything like that. Another thing I consider too is, I'm glad you brought up the stuff about looking at all the physical demands of sport. I think it took me like 3 months to be comfortable to ask my mentor Niles at Wake Forest about like, hey Niles, how come they get done with practice and they go straight to rehab, our football guys, or they finish their team lift and they go straight to rehab and he just drills them with the legs more. And his answer is like, Vin, you're at practice, right? I go, yeah. He goes, I mean, do you hear the sound of their cleats, for 2 hours every day, and then they go to team lift? And I go, that is true. So from Niles, I got the fact that it's important to go to practice, because now even in early rehab, I'm just trying to fatigue them and get their fitness up too. And one of my things that my athletes know me for is they could be 10 minutes late or they could be 10 minutes early. And they'll always hear me say, you're late. we have a lot to fit in. And every time they hear we got a lot to fit in, they say, Ben, you say that every freaking time. And it's because I'm just trying to get that load up. And even that, I was talking to a resident about it. I feel like we PTs in sports, at least at this level, load well. But again, comparing it to a 2-hour practice, especially in football and soccer, I just don't think we even transitioned them well enough between rehab to even the handoff to performance coach. So I really like that you put an emphasis on understanding the demands and being aware. And I think as much as I think we've improved, I still think we have ways to go. So just wanted to say thanks for bringing up all those points, amongst other things.
I think you're bringing up a great point about the most important thing, my own opinion, is understanding the demands of competition. However, there are many circumstances in many sports at many levels where we, as maybe in strength and conditioning, sports science, whatever, need to take into context the demands of practice, because there are many opportunities where practice is much harder than what occurs in a game in some facets. Now, the amplitude and like psychological arousal is way, way higher in the competition because there's lights, there's 60,000 people, there's screaming opponents, there's unfamiliarity, there's uncertainty. So there's some aspects that we'll never recreate. But in terms of like monotony and load and volume in practice, some of our training needs to go and think, how do we support an athlete who attains all the things that I talked about, all the workload descriptors in a 2 or 2.5 hour practice, Monday through Thursday, let's say for American football, and then an hour practice on Friday, plays the game on Saturday, and then has to lift on Sunday. How do we give them like the tools to perform and recover from performance for just the preparation part? So, and likewise, soccer, in my experience in soccer was slightly different because everything was so focused on everything we do during the week is to help support us as part of the game. And there were times where, we finally got our game legs underneath us and we were off and rolling and could do a couple games a week, not for endless periods of time. But it's fascinating with the individual demands of sport, from sport to sport and level to level, where you have to additionally ask yourself, okay, we need to perform well in the game because there's no trophy for, we practice super well Monday through Friday. There's no trophy for that. There's a trophy for winning games. And in theory, you think that if we're the best at practice Monday through Friday, that we should be winning on Saturday, if it's American football, for example. But that's not always the case. And sometimes there's too much of a disconnect between the demands of the game and the rudimentary monotony of the drills and some of the stuff they do in practice that just never match up. So that's why it's also useful. Define what actually goes on in the game. I don't care which tool or which method you use. Define the objective parameters of performance in the game from your style of play. I don't care if it's basketball, soccer, American football, hockey, lacrosse, whatever it is. Define that, work backwards from that. In the best case scenario, your practices should create the physical experiences and learning experiences that can at least try and closely mimic the experiences of passages of play in the game.
Yeah, I like you put that, because jokingly, I'm doing a presentation this Friday or next Friday, and like understanding what's realistic between each event. My little joke in there was, okay, here's a case example of a Division I soccer player, finishes the game, twists his knee, goes in the training room, feels fine, and then, goes to practice, feels fine. But the real thing is at the end, but then everything's fine, but then he actually goes home and plays spike ball and throws at his shoulder. So it's like not even related to practicing games, but it's like that little specific thing that people forget about, that it's not that. And this kind of brings into Corey's question, are there any reference on physical demand measures? All that stuff for like position specific sports. And there is, but a lot of it sounds from what I looked at is on gameplay and not practice. So that might be a little different. And Matt, you might know a lot more about the research there. But I can say there is out there for match play. And I don't know of any yet, but be on the lookout in the next 3 months for something published by Daniel Larson that's going to come out for all that. And it's going to have hopefully the information you're looking for. But Matt, you can maybe touch on that, on what the best way to get that data to help him plan his rehab.
Just so I'm clear about the question, I'm actually not able to see the typed question that came in.
I'll read it word for word for you. Are there any references on physical demand measures? So, for example, average sprint distance for male soccer midfielder in a match for various sports. I feel like this would be helpful with developing more specific late stage rehab protocols for patients.
Depending on the level
and position.
Yeah, depending on the level and position, might be worth an offline chat. I'm not aware of any off the cuff, but I know that they exist in different realms, but like in like European academies. So I wouldn't want to steer it wrong. What is sorely needed is an exploration of performance demands of competition for multiple ages, multiple sports, because that's continuing to evolve, especially through the context of, well, what style of play are you using? So soccer is a great example of, based on your formation and some of your tactical objectives, whatever the age frame is, what are the physical demands of a 14-year-old fullback in a 4-4-2 in an England academy versus what are the demands of a fullback in an MLS academy if you're playing a 4-2-3-1 where, the offensive wings, if you will, have more attacking responsibility. That type of granularity, a lot of time it's in-house. I can speak from our own standpoint of when I was with the Timbers. I was there from a transition of coaches. There was an old style of play. We kind of knew what the physical determinants of the positions were there. Then there's a new coach, new formation, new philosophy of tactics. And as we looked at the information, we looked at some of the relevant workloads, we went, these guys are a little bit less involved. These other guys are doing a lot more and a lot more specific type of work. How are we accounting for this? And it changed our paradigm on the fly, but we were luckily able to support those things because it was in-house, roll the sleeves up, capture it, define it. Unfortunately, we had a lot of compliant players that said, sure, I'll wear the GPS or whatever during the game. They're not mandated to in the MLS, but it's nice when they say, yes, I'll do that. Because it totally changed our thinking pattern and how we wanted to dose certain workloads during the week. Now, hopefully at younger levels, you would have more compliance so that you can ask those questions, because what's the impact? That's a great point to bring up. If you are supporting an athlete through an RTP and you're in the end stages and, okay, we finished the RTP, are they ready for 90 minutes of what? That's a big jump, as you all know. Like, okay, you're done with this rehab plan, but are you going to survive 15 minutes of on field? Like, are you even ready for that? So that's why it is super useful to have that as the question asked. I don't know of anything other than some of the like European academy figures. So maybe offline we talk shop and dive in together, because it's a very relevant question to be able to outline that approach, even to have like some context of what the norms are.
Yeah, and Ryan asked, how about anything for American football? I think there's two studies out there. One, Ryan, you've already read with the cutting study also has a high distance or high speed running distances, but it doesn't break it down to nuances like Matt broke out, like, how many, well, I mean, there are a number of accelerations too, I guess.
Are you talking about the woman study?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other side of that, I was thinking as Matt was talking, like, yeah, I feel like it's so dependent on teams, because you look at Wake Forest and I think they ran, I don't know, Ada, they ran like 90 to 100 plays per game or something like that versus the average of like 50 to 60. So I feel like it is a lot in-house, and that the hard part about that is getting a hold of that data. And then let's say a coaching change comes and you got to kind of recollect all that data. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with any of the football literature.
I think the hard thing about that too is you have 12 to 14, 15 games a year for college too. So you're trying to find the average of that. And it's like, how significant is that? And how much does that vary with, like, if you have a turnover, you run 10 less offensive plays, maybe, because you didn't have a long drive. It's kind of football. American football is kind of random like that. So I've always tried to kind of find I get that you have to tailor it towards your offense, but I've always tried to find like a study that has an average across, multiple teams. So haven't found any dividends for that yet, unfortunately.
I think that what I'm hopeful for is, now that sports technology has embedded itself at so many different universities, without name dropping. There's some big name GPS companies that cater to a big chunk of college football. And it would be wonderful. It'd be great to get like some population data of Division I wide receiver, like at least get some descriptive data of like what does a starter go through. But you're nailing it on the head. It's very difficult from team to team, even from season to season in the same program, to go, this is what we can expect out of this. I like from coaching football, I've just finished my third stint of high school football here over the past, 16, 17 years. We were running the same offense that had been at the school like the last 6 or 7 years, same base formation, all these things. But our distribution play calling because of our personnel was way different. So it's difficult, but at the same time, I'm hungry for more descriptive data from the population as a whole so that we can ask better questions of like, okay, great, I'm training this guy or rehabbing this guy or gal in the off season. What am I shooting for? Like I can get them stable to do the activity, but how much do they need to do the activity? Like that's is difficult, but hopefully, when I first looked into the research, like when in graduate school way back in 2013 or whatever it was, there weren't very many studies at all over workload distributions in American football. There's 1 or 2 studies at that time. And they were it was like, I can't remember the exact group breakup, but it was basically skill versus non-skill players. And the way that they had divided it up then was like linemen, tight ends, linebackers, and running backs were all put together. But inherently, they all have, like, they're on different sides of the ball. They have different responsibilities. And skill guys were, I think they may have excluded quarterbacks from the skill position, but wideouts, slots, nickel coverage, corners, safety, like they're all thrown in the same. And like, here's the average of this distance covered, and here's the average of that distance covered. And it was like, well, it's a good start, but we needed to go further. Unfortunately, I think that just the way that you would think in-house is we can ask more descriptive questions of at least the ballpark of what we're looking at so we know what we're building towards.
Yeah, I think something that'd be cool. I think it does have to be, if we wanted that data, I think it'd have to be mandated from, like let's say the ACC takes all teams average or something, or the NFL takes all teams average. Because something I think about is the UFC. So they published that 80-page report on injuries and performance, and it's an amazing document, well made, easy to read and apprehend the research or comprehend the research. So I would think it'd have to come from there because obviously no team wants to kind of give away their trade secrets. So I would think even with the wide ranges and differences we'll get, it's probably going to take a big governing body to mandate that these be made for the context of player safety, right? I think if that gets bigger and we could sell it that way, we can convince some of these bigger leagues, maybe 20 years from now, to publish all that info. Maybe a comparison between regular season and the new proposed football season length, stuff like that.
What's also interesting is there's resistance from some governing bodies of like high school sports, both locally and nationally, to even allow any type of wearable technology in a game, even explicitly for the purpose of, even if it's presented under the guise of like health and safety monitoring, which, some people would argue, how can you prove that or whatever? But, I've heard of conversations where there is, these governing bodies were in transition about, no, athletes are not allowed to wear any type of wearable technology in a game. We don't care if it's for health and safety. We're worried about how the data will be used against the player. And I'm thinking about, you have no idea how the data is used in the first place. So why are you worried about it being used against the player? I didn't even tell you what the data was. And maybe I just showed my hands that it was me asking questions to people, but I have a desire to know because there's only so many colleges and so many pro teams. Think of all the high school athletes across the country that are injured and need that support to get back to the demands. I think it'd be super useful for practitioners to have a better target to throw to because of how much hard work you all put in during the process to get them there. Like you all, I know, want to do as much as you can for the athlete as possible. So my hope is that we continue to move the needle in that direction of it's okay to ask a question. It's okay to try and, measure and monitor something let us do our job better for everybody else.
Yeah, joke's on them. They don't know what we're looking at because we don't even know what we're looking at. So
That's right.
yeah.
I have one question, not really related to, I guess, the last one. I think, as this technology has become more and more prevalent, and I've worked with it the last 2 years, and I've been at programs that utilize the menu of the practice and say, okay, you can go in these periods or you can go in these drills because the demands of sport are within your envelope of function. Do you think that there is a risk that we're almost exposing these athletes to so much volume because we know what the demands are that it'll be more difficult to hit those power numbers that we might want to see at the end stage of rehab because we're almost fatiguing them through those strength gains? I was just curious to get your perspective as somebody who's kind of really oversaw some of this technology for quite some time.
I would like them. Now, remember, I'm speaking from the point of like a performance coach in the sports side. I'm definitely don't want to speak outside of my lane and speak as a physical therapist or a practitioner in that regard. My preference is to see, can they handle the most intense amplitude, like velocity, speed, force production, etc. And then obviously all the things that you all are looking at are, can they do it well? Do they have good tolerance to it? Are they responding well to it? So can they do it well once? And then we can build volume on top of that. That would be my preference as well. I've also seen we got to get them fit and play. We just got to tear them down, and by golly, like they got to get in shape because, the mindset is almost of, okay, we're reaching through this final part of rehab. I need to beat this guy or gal into the ground because that's what's going to happen out there. I want to prepare them for that. And my personal thoughts are, I don't feel that way. I am concerned about particularly someone who's recovering from an injury, how their tissues are recovering from an injury, how their nervous system is now responding to getting back to where they or close to where they were, what their psychology at that standpoint of continuing to drive them into the ground. Does that give them confidence when they're still a step slow because you've been grinding out volume at the expense of intensity and quality? Again, I don't want to speak outside of my lane as a therapist, but I think you and I are thinking the same way about volume at the expense of quality. The old adage of don't mistake activity for achievement. I'd rather them achieve high quality amplitude and then build the quality of that rather than, let's go run some 200s and let's do this and let's just crush you. I want an athlete who maybe has had their psyche a little bit damaged or dealing with some of the psychological issues of being hurt. I want them rip-roaring, ready to chew through metal to go play because they feel so good and not like, oh my God, we got to do another thing, another here, another there. Then gradually build back up minutes in the sport. Like one thing that I'll be comfortable sharing about what we did with the Timbers, they didn't just jump back into 90 minutes. They didn't finish rehab and then go jump back into 90 minutes. There were many tiers of, we are going to make sure you are good along the way, of getting you fit in these certain things, but making sure you're hitting good peak amplitudes at certain intervals. And then there were several stages that we had outlined before we said, okay, this person's available for 90. But even once they were fully available for 90 full minutes, we still had ways of, hey, keep in mind, we've seen something in a certain time frame. So we'll keep extra eyes as a staff on them on the pitch during the field. I think you and I kind of feel the same way about quality first, and then let's build up that capacity over time again.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. And good question, Ryan. It looks like there's no other questions, so I guess we could kind of end it here. But thanks again for joining us, Matt. This will be uploaded, of course, for later viewers. But this kind of marks the end of it. So I think it was very fitting that you were on here to give us something that we're unfamiliar with. And honestly, sports science is still very, very new. And it's probably going to be the next thing that a lot of PTs look at. I know looking at the strength conditioning world, every NSCA conference I go to, I'd say 50% is about load monitoring in some way. So I kind of send the email, but it's going to be really hard for us to avoid this. I did recommend the textbook. I have no ties to it, but it's just an easy way for us to kind of get the basics down if anyone wants to read that.
It's a very palatable book. It's over here. I won't put it up on screen, but it's a palatable, relatable book. And, just because, you don't have a traditional sports science background, I think going through the process, I think it's so conceptually similar to what you all have been doing for years and years and years already that I think a lot of the concepts and how they're related that most every physical therapist can go, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because that's what I'm already doing. So.
Except with the smaller budget. Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, thanks again, Matt. Thanks everyone for viewing, and hope you guys have a good evening.
Great. Thank you all.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, Matt, could you make me host again? I'm just going to unrecord.